So having covered Spanish interwar tanks in my last episode, it's now time to take a look at Czechoslovakian interwar tanks that need adding to War Thunder, as Czechoslovakia was a nation that made great contributions to tank development in the interwar period in just a very short time, with all of this being cut short by the loss of the Sudetenland after the Munich Agreement and the subsequent splitting and occupation of the country in 1939. Though Czech tanks would go on to be used to great effect by the German army, and some development work on tanks would even continue under German control. So to go back to the beginning of the story, Czechoslovakia was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire during World War I, only gaining its independence in October 1918 as the war was ending, and the next few years were spent getting itself established as an independent nation. However, it would not take long for the new Czechoslovakian army to start acquiring new equipment, which would be greatly helped by the fact that the Skoda Works, the largest arms manufacturing company in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, was based in Czechoslovakia. However, when it came to acquiring its first tanks, it was decided, like with many other nations after World War I, to buy French Renault FT tanks, with 7 being delivered from 1921, not enough to form an armoured unit, but useful for training purposes and gaining familiarity with operating tanks. However, it was decided to have a domestic design that could be built within Czechoslovakia itself, as it was a landlocked nation that might end up cut off from suppliers in the event of a war. But domestic designs were either not forthcoming or did not meet the standards in the first years of the 1920s. This would change towards the end of the 1920s, when Czechoslovakia would build its first domestically designed tank. Basically in the late 1920s, the German engineer Josef Vollmer, who you might remember from my episode on German World War I tanks, given he was involved in practically every German tank programme then, was busy developing a new tractor based on the Hanomag WD-50 chassis, which utilised a wheel-cum-track system, allowing for the vehicle to run on either tracks or wheels, much like the Christie suspension system in America, and later used by the Soviets. And this system would be called the RR-50 or Raider Raupen 50. The Czechs found out about this design, and a licence for this system would be sold to Czechoslovakia, who would build 2 prototypes named the KH-50 or Kolo Hosenka. But after testing, it was decided that no more would be ordered, but they were instead offered for export, with the Soviet Union ordering 2 of the improved examples in 1927, with more powerful engines and named the KH-60. The Czechs at this point decided to upgrade one of the 2 KH-50s to the KH-60 standard, and used this as the basis for a new tank design, with a turret being fitted and steel plate used for the armour. Later on, either this chassis was modified or another one was constructed, this being given a simpler looking turret, and actual armour plate was now fitted. The turret was fitted initially with a Skoda 37mm gun, possibly a D27, but it seems at some point a gun from Vickers was also fitted, with some saying it was a 47mm gun, which, if it's the same one as used on the Vickers 6-ton, would give it a penetration of around 25mm at 500 metres. So not the best gun in the world, but not truly awful either, while I haven't found any stats for the Skoda gun. Unfortunately, a machine gun isn't carried, meaning the main gun is the only weapon available. The armour is pretty thin at only 6 to 14mm, and as mentioned, armour plate wasn't used on the initial model, but it was fitted to the second model. But even with armour plate, it wouldn't be able to stand up to too much incoming fire, so stand-up fights would have to be avoided. Unfortunately, the relatively large size of the vehicle does mean it will be hard to conceal from enemies, and makes it a pretty easy target to hit. Speed, on the other hand, is a bit of a mixed bag, as the top speed is about 22 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour, but this was when travelling on wheels, while the top speed on tracks is significantly slower at only 10 miles per hour or 15 kilometers an hour. Though some sources say that this is the top speed cross-country, so it would possibly be faster on paved roads. Either way, it would seem that this is not the fastest tank in the world, and while the wheeled mode is interesting, it supposedly took a minimum of 5 minutes to change modes in real life, so it's possible this wouldn't be implemented in War Thunder. Lastly, it only had a 2-man crew, again making the vehicle very easy to knock out. In-game, I suspect this would work at 0.3 to 0.7, though this depends on the main gun used, but even if it has a good gun, it still has extremely thin armour, a low crew count, a large size and not great mobility, which could cause this tank to struggle on the battlefield. In real life, the design would be upgraded for a 3rd time without the armament fitted, and this was then used in tests against imported Carden-Loyd Mark VI tankettes, before having its superstructure removed and placed in storage, with the chassis being assigned to the School of Assault Vehicles, where it remained until found by German troops after the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939. So attempts to build a domestic tank in the 1920s had failed, so in 1930 the Czech company CKD imported 4 Carden-Loyd Mark VI tankettes, and purchased a license agreement to produce them in Czechoslovakia. However, these vehicles were found to be pretty bad in testing. In fact, when an officer remarked that bullets could easily pass through vision openings and hit a crew member, Lieutenant Colonel Albrecht, head of the Department of the Military Technical Institute, who bear in mind had viewed the vehicles in Britain and had recommended buying them, replied that, quote, "That man would have been miserable anyway, it is better if he was taken by God." So yeah, even the people who recommended buying it did not have a particularly good opinion of it. The Czech army was understandably unhappy with the Mark VI, however it did provide a good starting point for CKD and Skoda, leading to CKD building the Tanshik VZ33, with 70 of these being built. Unfortunately, it was only armed with machine guns, so couldn't be added, but it was the start of a very successful Czech tank industry. Many more tankettes would be designed and built in this period, but in 1932 CKD would produce the first prototype of a new tank design, named the LTVZ34, or Lekki Tank Vzor 34. My apologies if I butchered that pronunciation, and this was a design that now looked like a modern tank. It was built on a modified Carden-Loyd chassis, and had a top speed of 19 miles per hour or 30 km an hour on a 62.5 horsepower engine, so it wasn't the fastest tank in the world but not the slowest either, and it was armed with the 37mm Skoda UV VZ34 gun, the same as used on the Panzer 35T, having an in-game penetration of 39mm at 500 metres with its stock APC shell, making this a decent threat to enemy tanks. Meanwhile, 2 7.92mm ZB VZ35 machine guns were carried, one in the bow and one in a coaxial position. So far this all sounds rather good, but unfortunately the armour does let it down a bit, as it is only a maximum of 15mm thick, so even large caliber machine guns might be a threat, let alone purpose-built anti-tank guns, so it would have to rely on not getting hit for the most part. Lastly, the crew is free, with the driver and machine gunner in the hull and the commander in the turret, again making this tank vulnerable to enemy fire, as a single shot to the hull is likely going to be enough to knock out all of the crew. In-game, I think this could be added at 1.0, as while it does have thin armour and a not great crew count, it is equipped with a decent main gun and decent mobility, so it should be able to have some success in-game, and it would be nice for this lesser-known Czech tank to be available for players. In real life, the prototype seems to have performed well, but there were delays in producing the 50 that were ordered, and by the time the first models were delivered in 1934, it was quickly realised that their thin armour was hopelessly vulnerable to enemy guns, so they were mainly used for training until replaced by the LTVZ35. However, there are reports that one was captured by Hungary during its invasion of Carpatho, Ukraine, an area which had declared independence in the aftermath of Czechoslovakia's occupation, while 18 would be taken over by the Slovak army, and 10 would be captured by partisans during the Slovak national uprising in 1944. So the LTVZ34 wasn't a great success, and a new tank would be needed. Thus 2 new tank designs were presented by CKD and Skoda, with CKD presenting the P2A, a light tank that still only had 16mm of armour, while the Skoda 2A design was heavier but now had 25mm of armour. The P2A was essentially just an improved version of the LTVZ34, so should have broadly similar stats to that vehicle, and could be added at the same battle rating, as it should perform much the same. In real life, the P2A was seen as reaching the limits of its potential for future development, so the Skoda design was chosen instead, and this would go into Czech service as the LTVZ35, with over 400 of these being built. Now, the LTVZ35 is already in-game under its German designation of Panzer 35T, as most of the existing tanks were taken into German service and used extensively in the early campaigns of the war up to Operation Barbarossa. Indeed, the Czech variant would be almost identical to the German version, but with one big difference, that being a reduced crew count of only 3, as the turret only had 1 man in Czech service, something the Germans weren't happy with, so they reduced the ammunition carried in order to fit another crew member, improving the efficiency of the design. That said, the LTVZ-35 would work at the same battle rating as the Panzer 35T, with the addition of being slightly more vulnerable. But it would be nice to see this Czech tank available for use in a Czechoslovakian tech tree, bringing to light its origin as a Czech tank to more people. Like with the previous LT-34, the LT-35 would be taken into German service and used to great effect in the first years of the war, while some would be taken over by the newly formed Slovakian state, and 2 of these would be captured by Hungarian forces in the Slovak-Hungarian border war of March 1939, which would lead to them inquiring about buying more Czech equipment and eventually led to the Hungarian Turan 1 tank, which we'll be covering later on. So the Czechoslovakian army now had 2 tanks in service. But by the mid-1930s, things were starting to heat up in Europe, with Germany quickly remilitarising after the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. So when some minor defects arose with the LT-35, it was decided to put out requests for a new tank design. Again, 2 designs were presented, the P2R, which I haven't been able to find much information on, and CKD's TNHS design. This basically being an improved version of a tank CKD had been exporting successfully for a few years by this point, as the TNH, and this new variant had a more powerful engine and gearbox. This tank would be accepted into service as the LTVZ-38, which again is a tank that is already in game as the Panzer 38T, and like with the LTVZ-35, its main difference is that it only had 3 crew in Czech service, with the Germans introducing the 4th crew member when they put it into production. And like with the LTVZ-35, it could go at the same battle rating as its German counterpart, with the main issue being its increased vulnerability due to having less crew, but like with the LT-35, it would be nice for Czech players to use this tank under the flag of its intended user. The LTVZ-38 would barely enter Czech service, with only 10 or so being produced by the time of the German occupation of Czechoslovakia. But unlike the LTVZ-35, the Germans would continue production of this tank, with over 1,400 being produced for German service, being instrumental in building up Germany's tank strength in the early years of the war, while the chassis would go on to be used for iconic vehicles like the Marder 3 and Jagdpanzer 38T, giving it a life that stretched across the whole war. It should also be noted that some of the export tanks from this time period could also be added, for example the LTL, which was intended to be sold to Lithuania. This was armed with a 20mm Oerlikon autocannon, had 25mm of armour, and a top speed of 34 mph or 55 km/h. So a pretty interesting tank with a fast firing weapon and able to get around the battlefield at a relatively quick speed. Ultimately, it was tested in Lithuania, but was returned to Czechoslovakia, and then Lithuania was annexed by the Soviet Union, so this never actually went ahead. But it would be interesting to see this added to War Thunder in some fashion, even if ultimately as a Czechoslovakian vehicle. So that is all of the major Czech tanks that entered service, but as you might have noticed, they were all light tank designs. But there were a few medium tank designs that never quite managed to enter service, with the first of these being CKD's V8H or STVZ-39. Unlike the light tanks, this was fitted with a more powerful 47mm Skoda A11 gun, which from what I can tell was capable of penetrating 48mm of armour at 500 metres at a 30-degree angle, broadly similar to the 47mm gun mounted on the Panzer Jaeger 1 in-game. So this is quite a bit more powerful than the 37mm guns of the light tanks, making this a far bigger threat to enemy tanks. In addition to the main gun, 2 7.92mm machine guns were carried, one in a coaxial position and one in the bow. Armour was improved at 32mm for the front and 20mm for the sides and rear, compared to the LT-38's 25mm and 15mm respectively, and is comparable to the early Panzer IIIs and IVs, making this a much better protected tank compared to the Czech light tanks. Meanwhile, the top speed is about 28 mph or 45 km/h, so it's actually a little bit faster than its light tank cousins, while a crew of 4 operated the tank. Honestly, the STVZ-39 would fit very well in War Thunder at battle rating 1.3 to 1.7, being a match for many Tier 1 tanks, and giving Czech players a good medium tank to use in War Thunder. As for its real life fate, In August 1938, an order for 300 was made before testing had even occurred, due to the ongoing threat of German invasion, with another 150 being ordered thereafter. However, after the Munich Agreement, the order would be cancelled, and despite being offered for export to various nations like the Soviet Union, Italy and Sweden, orders never materialised. Interestingly, after occupying Czechoslovakia, the Germans had a second prototype produced and tested at Kummersdorf, but decided against producing it as they already had a very similar tank available in the Panzer III. So the STVZ-39 was the nearest Czechoslovakia got to getting a medium tank into service, but there was a competing design in the S2C or T21, which was a bit further behind in development. Indeed, it had to go through a few rebuilds, having its engine replaced multiple times, and missing out on the deadline for army tests, knocking it out of the running for being adopted. However, it was worked on, and by the end of 1938, it was functional enough that it could be offered as an export tank to other nations. So it probably could still be added, if only as a premium or event tank. Stats-wise, it is very similar to the STVZ-39, having the same 47mm gun, a maximum armour of 30mm, a top speed of 31 miles per hour or 50 km an hour, and a 4-man crew, again making this a very good tank for around 1.3 to 1.7, and giving players the choice of two very good Czechoslovakian medium tanks to use. In real life, this did actually go on to have some success in the export market, as Hungary would order the vehicle, though with Czechoslovakia now being occupied by the Germans, they naturally wanted to use the production capabilities for themselves, so they refused the order. However, Hungary would get around this by instead purchasing a production licence to produce them domestically, and after modifications were made, it would be built as the Turan 1, the standard Hungarian medium tank of World War II, with 285 being built. Romania and Italy would also attempt to order the vehicle, but again the Germans refused these orders, so this was the end of the line for the T21. There would be other medium tank designs by Skoda and Tatra, but these weren't successful either, but they seem to have had 47mm guns, good armour and 4-man crews, though are a little bit on the slow side of things, but these could be added if needed. More designs would be produced after 1939, but none of these seem to have gone into mass production, with efforts instead focusing on producing the now Panzer 38T and the bewildering number of variants based on it. But there are a few tank destroyer-like vehicles that could be added as well, starting with the Skoda SID, a small prototype tank destroyer armed with the 37mm Skoda A3 gun as used on the LTVZ-34 and 35, as well as one machine gun, a maximum armour thickness of 20mm, a 2-man crew and a top speed of 25 miles per hour or 40 km an hour. This tank destroyer could probably work at 1.0, where its small size will allow it to carry out ambushes against enemies, though return fire will quickly deal with it. The vehicle would be shown to the Yugoslavians, who recommended some changes to it, and this new variant had a more powerful engine and slightly thicker armour, whereupon the Yugoslavians accepted it into service as the T-32. Skoda would produce another tank destroyer named the SIJ, which they hoped to sell to Yugoslavia as well, with this now having a 47mm Skoda A9 cannon, which I believe has very similar stats to the A11 from the V8H, as well as one machine gun, a maximum armour thickness of 30mm, a top speed of 19 miles per hour or 31 km an hour, and a 2-man crew. This could probably be added at 1.3, as it now has thicker armour and a much better gun, though the slower speed and 2-man crew is an issue. This vehicle would be shown to the Yugoslavians, but while they initially placed an order for 108 of them, their requirements changed, and so this remained a one-off prototype. There were also some more esoteric designs, like the Skoda PA2 Del, a one-off prototype based on the PA2 armoured car, which was fitted with a length 28 75mm cannon, making it a threat to most enemies in the lower tiers, though I haven't been able to find much information on its performance. Unfortunately, it is fixed to the front of the vehicle, meaning the whole car will need to be turned to engage enemies, which isn't great, while its thin armour of only 5.5mm will make this vulnerable even to machine guns. Lastly, it has a crew of 4 and a top speed of 28 miles per hour or 45 km an hour, meaning that it can at least relocate fairly quickly, though no doubt it will be slower when going cross-country. I could see this being added at 1.0 to 1.3, depending on how effective the main gun is, but it would be cool for this interesting prototype to be available as a Czechoslovakian vehicle. Only one of these vehicles would be made, and neither it nor the rest of the armoured cars of its class would see service with the Czech army, instead being used by the police. A more versatile tank destroyer would be the Mu-6 from 1931, which could probably be more described as a light tank or tankette, but I think it could work as a tank destroyer, as this is armed with an A2 47mm gun, which will no doubt be deadly to enemies, though its thin armour of only 5.5mm will make it vulnerable. But it does have a decent top speed of 25 mph or 41 km/h, as well as a 4-man crew. This could be added at 1.3, as it has a turret for easier engagement, but again it is extremely vulnerable to enemy tanks, so it will be very easy to knock out. There is also a few tank destroyers based on the Skoda 6MTP6 truck, with at least one carrying what looks to be a small caliber weapon, maybe 37mm or so, but also another one carrying the Length 71 40mm Z1 anti-aircraft gun, which has a muzzle velocity of 950 meters a second, allowing it to easily penetrate armour, with one source I've seen saying it can penetrate 32mm of cemented steel at 2,500 meters, which would seem to make it a very powerful weapon indeed. Unfortunately, it was found to be very inaccurate, so it wouldn't be likely to find success against enemy aircraft, but against tanks it should do pretty well. Other than the gun, it is based on a truck, so armour is non-existent. It has a top speed of 28 mph or 45 km/h, and would likely have a crew of 4 to 5, a driver and commander up front, and 2 to 3 men for the gun. Both variants could be added, the smaller gun variant at 1.0 and the Z1 at 1.3 to 1.7, as both variants should do very well against enemy tanks, with the latter especially being a nasty surprise for enemies, though their lack of armour could let them down. Finally, we come to the PuV-6, this being based on the Mu-6 hull but carrying the 40mm Z1 gun, and it was intended to be used against air and ground targets, but again would likely do better against tanks. Armour is again very thin at 5.5mm, but this barely matters because the fighting compartment is mostly open and can also be lowered if needed, making the 6 crew members rather vulnerable to enemy fire, while the top speed is 25 mph or 41 km/h. I think this could be added at 2.0, as it should be better off-road due to being a tracked vehicle, while the admittedly thin armour should at least provide better protection than the previous truck-based tank destroyers, while its effective gun would cause havoc for enemy tanks, and possibly even enemy aircraft if you are skilled at using the 40mm gun. In real life, the inaccuracy problems of the Z1 were too much of a problem for the Czech army, so it was never adopted, and it seems doubtful that the Mu-6 ever got much use after this either. So that's it for this episode looking at Czechoslovakian interwar tanks that I think should be added to War Thunder, and I'd be interested to see your views on these vehicles in the comments below. So I've now done 11 episodes looking at interwar tanks, and there are still lots more tanks that I could cover, but I think I'm probably going to move away from the interwar period at least for a little while, as it's now time to take a look at World War II tanks that need adding to War Thunder, so hopefully you will join me for that. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the episode, hopefully you've enjoyed the series as a whole. Thanks for watching, I've been Terreno, and I'll see you next time.